The baby was screaming. Not the soft, mewling cry of hunger or discomfort, but the raw, desperate wail of a child who had been passed between too many arms and trusted none of them. Celia Harper stood in the middle of the dusty main street of Redemption, Texas, in the blazing September heat of 1883, with little me pressed against her chest, and the whole town staring at her like she was a ghost that had wandered in from the wrong direction. She had not slept in 4 days. She was wearing a dress that had been her sister's, altered badly along the seams because Clara had been smaller everywhere, smaller in the shoulders, smaller in the waist, smaller in all the ways that mattered and in the one way that had ultimately killed her. The dress was brown calico, faded from too many washings, and it smelled faintly of lavender water that Celia could not bring herself to wash out. Me was 9 months old and she weighed approximately nothing and everything at the same time. She had Clara's dark eyes. She had the same small, determined chin. Every time Celia looked at her, she felt the grief claw up through her chest like something trying to escape, and every time she looked away, the guilt was worse. You should have come sooner, the guilt whispered. You should have been there. You should have written more letters, ridden faster, prayed harder. She had come as soon as she could. She had come too late. Clara was 3 weeks in the ground in a cemetery outside of Abilene, and her husband, a man named Denton Webb who had never deserved Clara for a single day of their 2-year marriage, had taken one look at the screaming infant, said he had no capacity for this, and walked out the door. He had not come back. He had left behind a bill of sale for the house, a handful of debts, and one furious, heartbroken sister who had arrived from Kansas City with $70 and a carpetbag to find a child that was hers now, because there was no one else. The baby screamed. The town stared. Celia squared her shoulders and walked forward because that was what she had learned to do. You squared your shoulders and you put one foot in front of the other and you did not let the grief swallow you whole, because there was a child against your chest and she needed you to be solid. She had a name on a piece of paper. A man named Levi Shepard, who owned a ranch called the Shepard's Rest 4 miles outside of Redemption. A woman in Abilene, a banker's wife named Mrs. Holt, had written the name down without explanation beyond. He's decent. If you need work, go to Levi Shepard. Celia had no other options and no more pride left to spend. She walked into the general store to ask directions, me hiccuping against her collarbone, and the woman behind the counter looked at the baby and then at Celia with the particular expression of a small-town woman calculating the weight of a scandal. "That your baby?" the woman asked. "She is now," Celia said, and something in her voice must have carried the full, terrible weight of that statement, because the woman behind the counter blinked and softened and said, "Shepard's place is north on the Clover Road. Look for the creek crossing and then a left. You can't miss the big cottonwood out front." Celia thanked her and walked back out into the September heat, and wondered how she was going to walk 4 miles with a screaming infant and a carpetbag when her feet already felt like they were bleeding. She did not have to wonder long. A wagon came rolling down the main street with a load of lumber in the back, and a man in the driver's seat who pulled up short when he saw her standing there on the boardwalk like something the wind had deposited. He was not a remarkable-looking man at first glance. He was tall in the way that ranchers got tall, stretched by years of working in wide, open spaces. He had dark brown hair under a battered hat, a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same limestone that made up this part of Texas, and the kind of sun-creased eyes that made it impossible to tell whether he was squinting or suspicious or simply thoughtful. He was probably 30, give or take. His hands on the reins were large and deliberate. He looked at her. He looked at the baby. He said, "You lost." "I'm looking for Levi Shepard," she said. Something shifted in his face, too subtle to name. "You found him," he said. "Who are you?" "Celia Harper," she said. "Mrs. Holt in Abilene said you were decent." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those impossible eyes, and then he looked at the baby again, and the baby, as if sensing some change in the atmosphere, stopped screaming for the first time in what felt like hours. The sudden silence was so profound that Celia nearly collapsed. "Get in the wagon," he said. That was not a decision, Celia realized. That was a man looking at a woman who was clearly at the absolute end of her rope and making the only choice that a decent person could make, and he had made it in about 4 seconds without being asked. She had expected negotiation. She had expected suspicion. She had expected him to ask about the baby's father or her husband or her references or any of the 100 humiliating questions that she had been bracing herself for. He just said, "Get in the wagon." She got in the wagon. Me looked up at the wide blue Texas sky as the wagon began to move and made a small, wondering sound, and Celia pressed her lips to the top of that dark-haired little head and breathed in the smell of her, which was warm and sweet and unbearably precious, and she thought, "I will not cry. I will not cry in front of this stranger." She did not cry, but it was very close. Levi Shepard did not pepper her with questions on the ride out to the ranch, which she appreciated more than she could say. He drove with one hand on the reins, and he let the silence sit between them without trying to fill it, which was a quality she had rarely encountered in men, and had not expected to find in a rancher in a small Texas town. The road was rough, and the lumber shifted in the back, and the cottonwoods along the creek threw shade at intervals, and me fell asleep somewhere around the 2nd mile, limp and trusting against Celia's chest. "She yours?" he asked, eventually, not prying. Just asking the way you might ask about the weather. "She's my sister's," Celia said. "My sister died." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry," 2 words. But they landed with the weight of something genuine, and Celia, who had heard 100 condolences in the past 3 weeks that had felt hollow and rehearsed, found herself believing this one. "The father?" he asked. "Gone," she said. "He left." He made a sound that was not quite a word, something low and disgusted and final. He did not ask anything else about Denton Webb, which was fortunate, because Celia was not sure she could describe the man without saying things that were unfit for polite company. The Shepherd's Rest was not what she had expected. She had been bracing herself for a rough working ranch, a bunkhouse and a bare kitchen and men everywhere, the kind of place where a woman alone with an infant would be a problem to be managed. What she found instead was a low, solid house built from limestone and cedar, with a wide porch that caught the afternoon breeze, a kitchen garden that someone had planted with genuine care, and a yard that was dusty but not chaotic. There was a barn, a corral with 4 horses, and in the distance, the long rolling line of the pasture where cattle moved like dark shapes against the golden grass. 2 ranch hands looked up when the wagon came in. An older Mexican man with a silver-threaded mustache and a younger one, barely out of boyhood, who was clearly his son or nephew. They looked at Celia and the baby with open curiosity but no hostility. "That's Felipe and his nephew Tomás," Levi said. "They won't bother you." He helped her down from the wagon without making it awkward, took her carpet bag, and carried it to the house. He opened the door and stood aside to let her in. The inside of the house was clean in the way that a careful person keeps a house clean, not spotless, but tidy. There was a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen with a cast iron stove, and a narrow hallway that presumably led to bedrooms. On the mantelpiece there was a small framed photograph of a woman and a boy, and Celia looked at it without asking. "I can cook," she said. "I can keep house. I can mend and garden and whatever else you need. I'm not asking for charity, I'm asking for work." He set her carpetbag down and looked at her directly. His eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, green-brown and complicated. "What happened to you?" he asked, not unkindly, just honestly. Celia had been expecting the question, and she had prepared a composed, factual answer, but what came out instead was, "Everything." The word surprised her as much as it surprised him. It hung in the air between them, more truthful than anything else she could have said. Levi Shepard nodded slowly, as if that answered something he had actually needed to know. "There's a room at the end of the hall," he said. "It has a good lock on the door. It's yours. We can work out the details in the morning." "You don't even know if I'm telling the truth," she said, because she was not a woman who accepted things without acknowledging their weight. "No," he agreed. "But I figure if you're lying, I'll find out soon enough. And if you're not, you could use a room and a good night's sleep more than you need me asking you to prove yourself." He was, she thought, a very unusual man. She went to the room at the end of the hall. It had a rope bed with a decent mattress and a quilt that was old but soft, and a small window that looked out onto the kitchen garden. There was a washstand with a clean basin and a pitcher, and she poured water and washed her face and Me's face and looked at the two of them in the small mirror above the stand. This woman who had been somebody's daughter and somebody's sister, and was now nobody's anything except this baby's entire world. She was 26 years old. She had been a seamstress in Kansas City, a good one, with a small shop and a respectable income, and a life she had built with deliberate, careful hands. She had left all of it behind without a backward glance when the telegram came about Clara. Me woke briefly, nursed from the small bottle of cow's milk that Celia had learned with difficulty to coax her into accepting, and then fell back asleep with the total confidence of an infant who had, finally, been placed in arms that were not going to let go. Celia lay down beside her and stared at the ceiling and waited for the grief to crush her. It did for a while. It always did. But eventually, the September heat and the exhaustion and the sheer physical relief of stillness pulled her under, and she slept. She woke before dawn to the smell of coffee. This surprised her enough that she lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house. The fire in the kitchen being built, the soft clank of cast iron. Outside, the first birds. Me still sleeping beside her, small and serious even in sleep. Celia rose and dressed carefully and went to the kitchen and found Levi Shepard standing at the stove in the gray pre-dawn light, making coffee and frying salt pork with the efficiency of a man who had been feeding himself alone for a long time. He heard her come in and did not startle. "Sleep?" he asked. "A little," she said. "She slept well." "Good." He poured a cup of coffee and set it on the table without asking if she wanted any, because it was obvious that she did, and she sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup and felt the warmth move through her like something being carefully restored. He set a plate of salt pork and cornbread in front of her. He sat across from her with his own plate and ate without ceremony. "Tell me what you need," he said, "and I'll tell you what I have." She appreciated that. No dancing around it. So she told him. She told him that she needed a place for herself and me, that she needed enough to cover me's needs and her own, that she was willing to work in any capacity that was honest, and that she was a good cook and an excellent seamstress. She told him that she did not know how long she would need the arrangement, that she was not trying to impose on his life indefinitely, that she had plans, vague and half-formed as they currently were, but plans. He listened to all of it with his creekwater eyes on his plate and his coffee cup, and occasionally on her face. "I've been cooking my own meals for 3 years," he said when she was done. "Felipe and Tomás eat at the bunkhouse. Ranch accounts need keeping and my handwriting is terrible. The garden out back could use someone who knows what they're doing. There's a town woman, Mrs. Alcott, who does the laundry every 2 weeks, so that's covered." He paused. "I have a spare room and I have enough. I don't need much in exchange." "I won't take charity," she said. "Then call it an arrangement," he said. "You keep the house and the books. I provide room and board. When you're on your feet, we renegotiate." It was fair. It was more than fair. It was the kind of fair that made her suspicious, because in her experience, things that seemed fair from men usually had a hidden motive buried somewhere in the fine print of the offer. "What do you want in return?" she asked bluntly. "The real answer." He looked at her then directly, and she saw something move across his face that was not offense or guilt or calculation. It was, she thought, recognition. As if he had been asked this question by himself about himself and had already worked out the answer. "Company," he said. "This ranch gets quiet." She did not know what to say to that. So she drank her coffee and ate her cornbread and watched the sun come up through the kitchen window over the limestone hills, and thought that there were worse things than an honest, quiet man who made good coffee, and had room enough in his house for 2 people who needed somewhere to be. The first week was a negotiation of space and routine. Celia was methodical by nature, which was the quality that had made her a good seamstress, and she applied it to the kitchen and the household accounts with the same precision she had applied to a bolt of calico. She found the account ledger, which was not in terrible shape but was maintained in Levi's handwriting, which was not technically terrible but was clearly the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write and had never quite forgiven the alphabet for being so complicated. She reorganized the kitchen. She found seeds for fall planting in a tin on the back porch and put them in the garden between Me's naps. Me was a discovery. Celia had been afraid that the baby would be a constant burden, a responsibility that she was not equipped to bear because she was not a mother, had never planned to be a mother, had been a sister and a businesswoman and a grown woman with her own life. But Me, as it turned out, was a person, with distinct preferences and strong opinions about things like the angle at which she was held and the particular sound that certain voices made, and she had opinions about Levi Shepard, which she communicated clearly. She liked him. She made this known the first time he came into the kitchen on the second morning and leaned down to look at her where she was sitting on the quilt that Celia had spread on the kitchen floor, and Me looked up at this large, sun-darkened stranger and laughed. Not giggled. Laughed with her whole body, a full-throated infant laugh of total delight. Levi looked startled in a way that was almost comical, and then something in his face softened so completely that it changed his whole aspect, made him look younger and less like limestone and more like creek water, and he looked at Celia and said, "She does that to strangers." "Not to anyone else," Celia said, genuinely puzzled. He crouched down to Me's level and made a face, and Me laughed again and grabbed at his finger with her small, determined fist. And Celia stood at the counter and watched this, and felt something shift in her chest that she was not ready to name. The history of the photograph on the mantelpiece revealed itself in pieces, the way things do in close quarters when secrets become unnecessary. On the 4th day, Felipe came to the kitchen door to tell her that Tomás had cut his hand on a fence wire and she helped clean and bandage it, and afterward Felipe said in his careful English, "You are a good woman, Miss Harper. Mr. Shepard, he does not bring many people to this house. Not since his wife. He was married." She said and was not sure why the information landed with the particular weight that it did. 3 years passed, Felipe said. She was a good woman. She died in childbirth. The boy, too. The photograph on the mantelpiece. The woman and the boy. She had assumed it was his mother and a sibling. She had been wrong. The boy was not a sibling. The boy was the child who had died with his mother. Celia stood in the kitchen after Felipe left and felt the shape of Levi Shepard's grief with a sudden clarity that made her breath catch. 3 years of keeping a clean house in a place that had once held a family, of cooking his own meals, of building something alone in the wide, quiet country, carrying the weight of a loss that had not been small. No wonder the ranch got quiet. No wonder he made room, she thought. He knew what it was to need it. That evening she went to sit on the porch after Me was asleep, which she had been doing as a way of gathering herself at the end of each day, and Levi was already there in the wooden chair at the far end, looking out at the dark line of the hills. She sat in the other chair. They did not speak for a long while. "Felipe told me," she said eventually. "About your wife, I'm sorry." He was quiet. "Margaret," he said, "and we called the boy Daniel. He never drew breath." She did not offer platitudes. She had received enough of them herself to know how insufficient they were. She said, "It doesn't go away, does it?" "No," he said. "It changes shape, but it doesn't go away." She thought of Clara, of the particular way her sister had laughed at her own jokes before the punchline landed, of the letters she had written on pale blue paper, of the terrible weight of the telegram. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in the dark for a while longer, and it was, she thought, one of the most honest things she had experienced since Clara died, this sitting with someone else who understood what it was to carry something enormous and had not made the mistake of putting it down too quickly. The second week brought complications. A man came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning in a good suit and a bad mood. He rode a bay horse, and he rode it with the particular posture of a man who wanted everyone to know that the horse was expensive. He tied up at the porch rail and called out for Shepard, and Levi came out from the barn, and they stood in the yard, and the conversation, which Celia could see from the kitchen window but could not hear, was clearly not pleasant. She watched Levi's jaw set, watched his arms cross, watched the other man gesture expansively, and then apparently demand something, and watched Levi shake his head once, hard, the way a man does when the answer is no and will not become anything else regardless of the pressure applied. The man in the good suit left on his expensive horse without the thing he had come for, and Levi came back inside with the set expression of a man who had just had an old argument. She did not ask. She was not going to pry. But that evening, while she was going over the ranch accounts, she noticed that there was a debt. Not a catastrophic debt, but a real one, to a man whose name on the ledger was R. Calloway, and the terms of the loan were written in the careful hand of someone else, a lawyer presumably, and they were not generous terms. The debt had been taken on 2 years ago, around the time Celia estimated Margaret and Daniel had died, and she understood without being told that a man who has just buried his wife and child is not in the best condition to negotiate favorable loan terms. She put it away and said nothing. It was not her business. Not yet. But she thought about it. The rhythm of the ranch became her rhythm. She discovered that she liked the early mornings, the way the light came up slowly over the hills, the smell of the sage and the cedar, the quiet that was not actually silence but full of the sounds of the land. She had lived in cities her entire adult life, in Kansas City with its streets and its noise and its particular kind of energy, and she had thought she needed that energy, had thought she was a city woman through and through. But there was something about the wide horizon and the quality of the air and the way the light moved through the day that felt like it was reaching into her and undoing knots she had forgotten she had tied. Me thrived. Me began to sit up on her own around her 10th month, and the entire ranch celebrated this as if it were a significant political event. Felipe brought a small carved wooden horse that he had apparently spent a week making in his off hours. Tomás taught her to clap, which she then did indiscriminately at everything: the chickens, the sound of the wind, the bottom of her food bowl. Levi, who had been circling the baby with the careful attention of a man who is deeply invested and pretending not to be, began picking her up in the mornings when he came through the kitchen, and me would grab his face with both hands and stare at him with Clara's dark eyes as if she were conducting an examination, and he was meeting her standards. Celia watched this and felt the warmth of it alongside the grief of it, because me grabbing Levi's face looked like something Clara should have been there to see, and the joy and the sorrow had become so thoroughly braided together that she could not experience one without the other. She was sitting at the kitchen table one evening, mending one of Levi's shirts which had a tear along the shoulder seam from a fence post, and me was asleep, and Levi came in from the last check of the horses and sat down across from her and accepted the coffee she had left on the stove for him, and he watched her mend. "You're fast," he said. "I was a seamstress," she said. "In Kansas City. I had a shop." "You gave it up to come for the baby." It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. "I gave up everything," she said, and it came out without self-pity, which was the only way she could say it without the grief winning. "The shop, the apartment, the life I had, but I wasn't going to leave me with strangers, and there was no one else." She paused. "Clara was my only family." What was she like? Nobody had asked her that, not in the 3 weeks since Clara had died. People had said they were sorry. People had said it was God's will. People had said a dozen things that were well-intentioned and completely useless. Nobody had asked what Clara was like. Celia put the shirt down and thought about her sister, truly thought about her, and the grief came up, but she let it because this was the good kind, the kind that was also love. "She was funnier than me," she said, "by a significant margin. She could make strangers laugh in under a minute. She was stubborn about the wrong things, which I told her, and she never listened. She was a terrible cook, but she pretended not to be, which drove me absolutely mad because it would have been so easy to just admit it. She picked Denton Webb out of a list of better options because she thought she could fix him, which was the thing about Clara. She always thought she could fix people. She stopped. She couldn't fix him, but she was right about it in every other case. She was crying, she realized. Not dramatically, just steadily, the way rain comes down sometimes, without storm, just persistent and quiet and necessary. Levi reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He did not say anything. He just put his hand there, warm and solid and present, and left it. She looked at his hand and she looked at his face, and she thought that this man, this quiet, careful, grief-worn man, was the most genuinely decent person she had encountered in a very long time. And that scared her in a way that Denton Webb's abandonment and the long road from Abilene and the screaming baby and all the rest of it had not scared her, because all of those things were losses she already knew how to carry. But this was something she did not yet know the shape of. She did not pull her hand away. She let him hold it for a while, in the kitchen light, with the mended shirt on the table between them and me asleep down the hall and the wide Texas night outside the window. And when she finally did pull her hand away, it was gently and without apology, and he understood, because he was that kind of man. The third week brought the man in the good suit back, but this time he brought a friend, and the friend was wearing a badge. Celia was in the garden when they rode in, and she straightened up and looked at them with the dirt on her hands and me on the blanket nearby. And there was something in the way they rode, the deliberate, slow arrogance of it, that told her this was not a social call. R. Calloway, because that was clearly who the suited man was, stepped down from his horse and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was used to being the most important person in any given room and was adjusting to the outdoors. "Where's Shepard?" he said. "I'll fetch him," she said, and did not add the words that occurred to her, which were several and pointed. She went to the barn and found Levi replacing a broken hinge and told him quietly, "There's a man in a good suit and a man with a badge in the yard." She described the suited man. Levi's face did not change, but something behind it did. He set the hinge down and wiped his hands on his trousers and walked out of the barn with the deliberate, unhurried walk of a man who is not afraid, but is also not making things easy for anyone who might want him to be. Celia followed. She was not going inside. She was not going to pretend this was not happening. Whatever the dark past of this debt was, she was not going to stand in the kitchen and not know about it. Calloway watched her stay in the yard with an expression that suggested he found this inconvenient. "Shepard," he said, "the payment is 3 months overdue. The terms of the loan specify that at 60 days overdue, I have the right to pursue collection of the collateral." "The collateral being my land," Levi said. "The east pasture specifically, as written in the agreement." "The east pasture is where 80% of my winter grazing is," Levi said, still in that flat, even voice. "Taking it would effectively end the ranch." "That's not my concern," Calloway said. He said it with a smoothness that suggested it was not his first time saying it, that he had said it about many men's livelihoods and had never lost sleep over any of them. The man with the badge, who was the county sheriff, stood at Calloway's shoulder with the expression of a man who was being paid to be present and was not entirely comfortable with the assignment but had made his peace with it. "I'll have the payment in 30 days, Levi said. "The deadline was 60 days ago, Calloway said. "Then give me 30 more. The agreement doesn't provide for extensions." Celia had been listening and calculating. 30 days. The amount outstanding was $700, which she had seen in the ledger. A significant sum, an impossible sum for a ranch that was operating close to its margins. She thought about her shop in Kansas City, which she had sold in 2 days to a woman who had been wanting it for years and had paid cash and paid quickly. She thought about the money she had brought with her, not $70 but considerably more, because she had not told anyone how much she had, because a woman alone on the road with a baby had enough to worry about without announcing that she was carrying the proceeds of a sold business. She had $430 in the lining of her carpet bag. She had sewed it in herself because she was a seamstress and because she was not a fool. $700, she said. Both men looked at her. Levi looked at her. That's the outstanding amount, she said to Calloway. I'll have it in 30 days. Calloway studied her with the expression of a man trying to determine whether she was serious or delusional. And who are you? He said. Celia Harper, she said. I'm the one who keeps the accounts, which was true technically. Miss Harper has no stake in this property, Calloway said. That can be changed, she said. 30 days. It was a bluff. She had $430, and she needed 270 more, and she had no idea where she was going to get it. But she had discovered in Kansas City that the most important thing about a negotiation is that you must never let the other person see the edge of what you have. Calloway and the sheriff rode away without committing to the 30 days, but also without doing anything immediate, and Celia stood in the yard and felt the enormity of what she had just said settle over her. Levi was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. $430, she said. That's what I have. That's the actual number. I need to find the rest. You can't use your savings for my debt, he said. I can do whatever I choose with my money, she said. And I choose to use it to keep this ranch from being stolen from you on the technicality of a predatory loan. Now stop arguing with me and help me figure out how to find the other $270 in 30 days. He looked at her for a long moment. The limestone jaw was working. He was not a man who accepted help easily, she could see that, could see the resistance in every line of him, but she could also see that he was not a fool and that he understood what it would mean to lose the east pasture. There's cattle ready for market, he said slowly. 20 head that I was planning to move in October. If we move them now at current prices in Abilene, we could get 300 at minimum. Then we move them now, she said. It's a 4-day drive to Abilene, he said. Then you should get started. He went to Abilene. He took Felipe and Tomás and the 20 head of cattle, and he was gone for 4 days. And Celia kept the house and the garden and me and the ranch accounts. And she did not allow herself to think about the particular quality of the quiet that descended when he left, which was different from the quiet she had arrived into, which meant something she was still not ready to name. Me was pulling herself up to standing now, holding onto the furniture with a look of intense concentration and enormous self-satisfaction. She had Clara's stubbornness, clearly. She had Clara's refusal to accept that there were things she could not do yet. Celia watched her and laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time since the telegram had come, and then cried afterward because Clara should have been there to see it, and then dried her eyes and picked me up and danced with her around the kitchen, because that was also something Clara would have done. Levi came back on the 5th day with $340 and the news that the cattle market in Abilene had been better than expected. He handed her the money, the actual physical money, which was a gesture of trust so complete that she stood still for a moment holding it. The total is $770, she said. More than enough, he said. I'll keep the excess in the accounts, she said. For the ranch, he looked at her. For the ranch, he repeated. Yes, she said. Since I'm apparently the one keeping the accounts. Something flickered in his face. Something that might, in a different light, have been the beginning of a smile. They paid Calloway on day 28. Celia went with Levi to do it because she had negotiated the extension and she was going to be present when it concluded. Calloway took the money with the expression of a man who has been denied a thing he wanted and is computing how to want it again differently. He signed the receipt of payment and handed it over and said, pleasantly, that he hoped they would not find themselves in this position again. We won't, Celia said. Because I'll be managing the accounts going forward, and the accounts will not be carrying any loans at those terms. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon, and at some point along the Clover Road, Levi began to laugh. Not a big laugh, not a performative laugh, but a real one, quiet and genuine, and she looked at him and felt the warmth of it move through her like the coffee had moved through her that first morning, like something being carefully restored. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just," he paused. "I'm glad you got in the wagon." "So am I," she said, and meant it more than she was entirely comfortable admitting. October in the Texas Hill Country was extraordinary. The light went gold, and the sumac turned red along the creek, and the mornings had a bite to them that made the coffee taste even better. Me began taking her first experimental steps, 3 at a time, and then sitting down hard and looking surprised, and the whole ranch stopped working to watch her do it. Even the horses seemed interested. Celia had begun to sew again, in her room in the evenings after me was asleep. She had found fabric at the general store in Redemption, good calico and some wool for the coming cold, and she made me 3 proper dresses and 2 sets of warm stockings and a small coat, and she made herself 2 new house dresses because Clara's faded calico had finally given up at the left shoulder seam in a way she could not honestly repair. She was working on a shirt for Levi, measuring the shoulders from the shirt she had mended and the approximate dimensions she had been observing since she arrived. Not that she had been observing deliberately. It was simply what you did when you were a seamstress, and you were making someone a shirt, and they were standing approximately 10 feet from you regularly. She had also begun to observe, which was different from noticing, that Levi Shepard had a particular quality of attention. When he was talking to her, he was actually talking to her, not looking past her at the next thing he needed to do, not formulating his own response while she was still speaking. He listened with his whole attention, the way very few people did, and the effect of this was that conversations with him felt significant even when they were about practical things like the feed situation, or the kitchen garden, or the best way to get the stove to draft properly in a north wind. He had started saving her the last cup of coffee in the evening, the one she had not asked for but always wanted. She had started leaving a lamp on in the kitchen when he was working late in the barn. These were small things. They were not small things. She was in the garden on a clear October morning when he came and stood at the garden fence with his arms along the top rail, watching her thin the winter carrots, and he said, "Tell me something about Kansas City." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. The morning light was behind him, and he looked like something that belonged to this landscape, solid and uncomplicated in his outline, with all the complexity saved for his face. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "Anything," he said. "You never talk about your life before." She thought about it. She thought about her shop, the blue door she had painted herself because the landlord would not do it. She thought about her apartment above a bakery and the smell of bread in the morning. She thought about the women who came to her shop for the important dresses, wedding dresses and christening clothes and the dress for your daughter's first dance, and the weight of that privilege and responsibility. "I made a wedding dress once," she said, "for a woman who had been engaged 3 times before and called off all 3 engagements because she said none of the men were worth the dress she'd planned." She paused. "The 4th man," she said, "was the first one who was worth it." He was quiet for a moment. What was different about the 4th one? "She said he made room for who she actually was," Celia said, "not who he wanted her to be." The words landed in the morning air and sat there between them, and she watched him take them in with his creekwater eyes, and she felt the color rise in her face because she had not quite meant to say something that pointed and there was no graceful way to take it back. "That's a good standard," he said quietly. She turned back to the carrots, and he stayed at the fence for another moment and then went back to whatever he had been doing. And she stayed in the garden and let the October sun warm her shoulders and did not think deliberately about what it meant that she was starting to feel in this limestone house in the Texas hills, like someone worth making room for. The trouble with the town came in November. Redemption was a small town with all the small town appetites, and one of those appetites was for narrative, for knowing the shape of other people's lives and fitting them into categories that made sense. Celia Harper was proving resistant to categorization, and this bothered certain people. It came to her through Mrs. Alcott, the laundry woman, who was not an unkind woman but was a thorough one, and who arrived one Monday morning with the clean laundry and the information that the ladies of the church auxiliary were talking. What they were saying, Mrs. Alcott relayed with the particular combination of discomfort and relish that gossip produces in people who know they are passing it on, was that Celia Harper was living on Levi Shepard's ranch without benefit of marriage, and that whatever story she told about whose baby that was, a woman alone with an infant didn't end up on a widower's ranch for innocent reasons. Celia listened to this with her hands flat on the kitchen table and her expression, she hoped, composed. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I thought you ought to know," Mrs. Alcott said, with the genuine warmth of a woman who is on your side and the particular helplessness of a woman who is part of a social system she can't entirely step outside of. After Mrs. Alcott left, Celia thought about it. She thought about what it meant for Levi, who had his reputation in this town, who bought his supplies here and sold his cattle through contacts here, and whose word was presumably known and trusted by the people who mattered. She thought about what it meant for me, who was 9 months from being someone who would grow up here and go to school here and be shaped by how this community saw her and the woman who raised her. She found Levi in the barn and she told him directly, because that was how she did things. He listened with the fence post expression, the one he used when he was holding something still inside himself. "I'll move to town," she said. "I can find work. It's not ideal, but no," he said. "Levi," she said. "No," he said again, and he said it with a finality that was not stubbornness but conviction, and she looked at him and saw that he was working his way toward something else, something that was sitting in him like it had been sitting there for a while. He put down what he was holding. He turned to face her fully. "There's a third option," he said. She waited. "Celia," he said, and the way he said her name, not formally, not carefully, but with a directness that stripped everything else away, made her heart do something complicated. "I've been thinking about asking you something for a while, and I keep waiting for the right moment, which I've concluded there isn't one, so I'm going to ask it now." She did not say anything. She waited. "I know this is unconventional," he said. "I know it's fast, and I know you came here with your hands full and your heart broken, and the last thing you were looking for was this. But I need you to know that I'm not asking because of the gossip or the arrangement or any practical reason. I'm asking because I have been waking up every morning for 2 months glad that you're here. I'm asking because you are the most capable, honest, clear-eyed woman I have ever met, and I have been trying not to love you since roughly the 3rd day you were in my house, and I have not been successful." He paused. "Will you marry me?" The barn was very quiet. Somewhere outside, one of the horses shifted. Me, who was in the house, made a distant, cheerful sound. Celia looked at this man, this limestone jaw, creek-water-eyed, decent, grief-worn, careful man who had taken her in without questions and made room for all of it. The baby and the grief and the complicated, battered, surviving self that she had brought with her. And she thought about the 4th man, the one who was worth the dress, the one who made room for who you actually were. She thought about Clara and what Clara would say, and she heard it clearly, her sister's voice, both bossy and loving. "Celia Marie Harper, if you walk away from this man, I will haunt you from the grave." "I'm not easy," she said. "I need you to know that. I have opinions and I will act on them, and I will keep the accounts, and I will argue with you when I think you're wrong." "I know," he said. "I'm counting on it. And me is mine," she said. "She is my daughter in every way that matters, and whoever marries me marries that fact without reservation." "I know that too," he said, and his voice when he said it was so simple and certain that it reached into the grief-braided part of her and gently untied something. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. It was the breath of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. He crossed the barn and she did not move away, and he took her face in both his large, careful hands and he kissed her. And it was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who has made up his mind. And she kissed him back with everything she had been refusing to name for 2 months. And the barn smelled of cedar and hay and the cold edge of November air. and somewhere outside, Felipe called to Tomás about something entirely unrelated to any of this, and it was perfect. The wedding was in December, on a clear, cold day with the hills blue and white in the distance and a fire in the church hearth. Mrs. Alcott, who had delivered the gossip in November, showed up to the wedding with a ham and an apology and a genuine smile, and became, over the following months, one of Celia's closest friends in redemption. The minister was a man named Reverend Gaines, who had a long white beard and an excellent speaking voice, and who performed the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he found it sincerely pleasing. Celia wore the white dress she made herself in the 6 weeks between the proposal and the wedding. White was not strictly practical, and she knew it, but she was a seamstress and she was getting married, and she was going to make the dress she would have made for a bride who deserved the best she could do, because she had decided, somewhere in those weeks, that she deserved that too. Felipe and Tomás stood in the little church with their good shirts and their absolute sincerity. Me sat on Mrs. Alcott's lap in the front pew, wearing the blue dress that Celia had spent a week on, with 3 tiny white buttons and a lace collar that she had tatted herself from a pattern she had memorized years ago. Me behaved impeccably through the vows, and then, at the moment the minister pronounced them married and Levi kissed Celia in front of God and the assembled residents of redemption, me clapped. The whole church laughed. Celia laughed too, her husband's hands warm on her face, her daughter's applause ringing through the little church, and the grief was there too, like it always was, because Clara should have been there. Clara should have been in the pew with a handkerchief and an expression that said, "I told you so." But the grief was braided now with something stronger and brighter, and she did not have to fight it anymore. She just carried it, the way you carry the things that are yours. The first winter at the Shepherd's Rest as a married woman was different from the weeks before it. Not dramatically different in its outward shape. The same house, the same routine, the same accounts to keep and the same kitchen to cook in and the same wide Texas sky, but different in some interior quality that Celia, who had prided herself on being someone who required no one, found herself surprised to value as deeply as she did. She was not alone anymore. She had not realized how completely alone she had been until she wasn't. Levi was not an easy man in the sense that he required no work. He had the silences of a man who had spent years with his own thoughts and had organized them in ways that did not always easily translate to conversation. He had the habits of someone who had been responsible for everything himself for a long time and occasionally forgot, with genuine apology when reminded, that there was now someone to share that responsibility. He had the grief still for Margaret and Daniel, which Celia understood and did not resent, because she had her own grief, and she understood that love is not a fixed resource that diminishes when it is divided. What he was, consistently and without exception, was present. He was there. When she woke in the middle of the night with the particular, crushing weight of missing Clara, the warm, solid fact of him beside her was something she had not known she needed until she could not imagine being without it. When she was frustrated with the accounts or with the weather, or with Me's refusal to sleep through the night for 3 consecutive nights during a cold spell, he listened, and he responded, and he did not offer solutions to things she needed to simply say aloud. He was learning her. She could feel it, the deliberate attention of a man who was making a study of who she actually was, not to find her wanting but to understand. And she was learning him, the limestone jaw that wasn't stubbornness but steadiness, the creekwater eyes that weren't distant but thoughtful, the hands that were large and were cruffined, and had a care to them that she had never encountered in a man's hands before. She loved him. She had known it before the proposal, if she was honest, had known it somewhere around the 2nd week when he had held her hand across the kitchen table after she told him about Clara, but she had been protecting herself, had been keeping the feeling behind a careful wall, and the wall had come down in the barn on the November morning and she had not rebuilt it. She did not think she ever would. Me turned 1 year old in February, A cold, sunny day that Felipe marked by constructing a small cake from cornmeal and dried fruit that was not technically a birthday cake, but was eaten with great enthusiasm by all parties including me, who wore most of it. Celia stood at the edge of all this cheerfulness, watching her daughter and her husband and the two men who had become, in their way, part of this small family, and she thought about Clara as she did every day, but this time the thinking had a different quality. It was still grief. It would always be grief. But it was grief with gratitude wound through it now, gratitude that Clara had lived, that she had been loved, that she had left behind this impossible, extraordinary small person, and that somehow, by the grace of a woman in Abilene writing a name on a piece of paper, that small person had ended up here in this limestone house in the Texas hills with all these people who loved her. She could feel Clara saying, "See, I told you. You just have to trust the thing." The spring brought changes. Calloway had not given up, which she had not expected him to. He was not the kind of man who accepted a closed door. He came at Levi's land from a different angle in March, approaching the county commissioner with a claim that the eastern boundary of the Shepherd's Rest had been incorrectly surveyed, and that a strip of land along the creek was legally his. It was the kind of claim that was expensive to dispute, because disputing it required a surveyor and a lawyer and time in front of the commissioner, all of which cost money and goodwill. Celia went to the county commissioner herself, on a Tuesday morning in March, with me on her hip and the original land deed in her bag, and the 3 years of account records that she had organized since her arrival, and a very clear, very quiet voice that she had learned in Kansas City dealing with suppliers who thought she was a woman, and therefore negotiable. She laid out the case. The survey dates, the deed language, the legal precedent she had looked up in the 3 volumes of Texas property law she had found in the back of the general store and borrowed from the proprietor, who had forgotten he owned them. She was not a lawyer. She did not pretend to be. But she was meticulous and she was prepared and she was not afraid of a man behind a desk, and by the end of the meeting the commissioner had agreed to commission an independent survey. The survey came back in April. The boundary was as the deed stated. Calloway's claim was dismissed. He came to the ranch one final time in April and Celia met him on the porch. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I want to be very direct with you. I have kept every record of every interaction between your office and this ranch for the past 8 months. I have the loan documents, the payment receipt, the county commissioner correspondence, and the survey results. If you approach this ranch or this family again in an adversarial capacity, I will make all of it available to the regional land office in Austin, which I have already written to in an informational capacity." Calloway looked at her with an expression that had moved past calculation into something that might have been, if she were generous, a grudging respect. "You're a formidable woman, Mrs. Shepard," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I am." He rode away and did not come back. She went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and shook for about 3 minutes, because she had been terrified and had not shown it, which was exhausting. Then she poured herself a cup of coffee and felt the warmth restore her and went back to the accounts. Levi came in from the barn and looked at her face and at the empty yard and said, "He's gone. He's gone," she said. He sat down across from her and looked at her with the full weight of his Creekwater attention, and she saw in his face something that she had not fully reckoned with before, that he was looking at her with a kind of wonder, genuine and unguarded, the way you look at something that exceeded what you thought was possible. "Thank you," he said. "It's our ranch," she said. His throat moved. "Our ranch," he repeated, and said it as if he were putting it somewhere permanent. Summer came to the Shepherd's Rest with its heat and its wildflowers. The bluebonnets already gone, but the Indian paintbrush burning red along the creek, and the black-eyed Susans covering the south pasture in a wash of gold. Me, who was walking confidently now at 14 months, and talking in the compelling nonsense of early language, had developed a passionate relationship with the horses, specifically with a broad, gentle bay mare named Clover, who was old enough to have seen everything, and was surprised by nothing, including an enthusiastic toddler who wanted to be lifted to pet her nose every morning. Levi lifted me to pet Clover's nose every morning with the patience and care of a man who had found that fatherhood, the word he used in his own mind before he used it out loud, was not a burden. It was not even a surprise. It was simply a fact of who he was, a fact that had been waiting for the right arrangement of the world to become visible. He said it out loud one evening, the word, in the context of explaining something to me about why horses need water, and he said it without thinking, and then looked up and found Celia watching him from the doorway, and the look on her face made him forget what he had been saying entirely. "She needs to hear it," Celia said, and her voice had the particular quality it got sometimes, soft and clear at the same time. "From you." "I know," he said. "I'm her father, I should say it." She crossed the yard and stood beside him, and me was between them, and Clover was patient above them, and the summer evening was gold and warm and smelled of grass and cedar, and it was, he thought, the most complete thing he had experienced in 3 years. He was going to tell her, he decided. He was going to find the words for what she had done, not just for me and not just for the ranch and not just for him, but for the particular quality of the world that had changed when she stepped out of that wagon in September carrying a screaming baby and a carpet bag and the absolute wreckage of her grief, and had somehow, in the process of being all of that, become the center of his life. He told her that night on the porch, when me was asleep and the stars were extraordinary above the Texas hills, and the coyotes were at the far edge of the world. He told her about the 3 years after Margaret. He told her about the way the house had sounded empty even when he was in it. He told her about Felipe and Tomás, who were good men, and the cattle which were a purpose and the accounts which had been a mess before she arrived, and how none of it had been enough because none of it had been what he'd lost, which was not just Margaret specifically but the shape of a life that included other people, the daily, unremarkable warmth of being known. "I was managing," he said, "but I wasn't living. Not really. And then you got in the wagon, and you had me, and you had all that grief and all that capability at the same time, and it was like watching someone prove that it was still possible to be both those things at once. I thought, if she can carry all of that and still be standing, then I don't have any excuse to stay as small as I've been." She was listening with her full, still attention, not filling the silence as he left. "You made me want to be bigger than my grief," he said. "I needed to tell you that." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the stars. "Clara would have liked you," she said. "She would have given you a hard time first because that was her way, but she would have liked you." "I hope so," he said. "She would have said you have a good face." She paused. She was right about faces. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had in the kitchen, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat in the August night for a long time without needing to say anything more, which was itself a kind of language, the most comfortable kind. She told him that fall, on a cool October morning, that she was expecting. She told him matter-of-factly, because that was her way, standing at the kitchen counter making biscuits, and she told him with the flour on her hands and the morning light coming through the window and me asleep down the hall, and the telling had a particular combination of happiness and terror in it that was, she suspected, universal to parents and not specific to their circumstances. He was still for a moment. And then he crossed the kitchen and took her flour-covered hands in his and held them and looked at her with those creekwater eyes that were, in that moment, not complicated at all. "Are you afraid?" he said. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "But not of the right things," she laughed. She loved that he could make her laugh. The pregnancy was not easy in the first months, which meant that the household arrangements shifted, which meant that Levi learned, without complaint and with more proficiency than she had honestly expected, to cook a reasonable breakfast and keep me occupied while Celia was at her worst in the mornings. And she emerged into the kitchen on better days to find flour on the counter, and me wearing what appeared to be a hat she had made from an inverted bowl, and Levi looking at both of them with the expression of a man who is deeply satisfied with the chaos he is navigating. By December, which was their first wedding anniversary, and also the point at which Celia felt consistently well enough to return to the kitchen without incident, she had begun to feel the baby move, small, uncertain flutterings that made her sit still and press her hands to the warm curve of her belly, and think about everything that had happened in 14 months. She had arrived in September 1883 with a carpetbag and a screaming baby, and the ruins of a life she had not expected to rebuild. She had been afraid and exhausted and furious at a world that had taken Clara before Clara had a chance to see the best of it. She had not come to redemption looking for love. She had not come here looking for anything except a way forward that did not require her to be anything other than what she was. And yet, she sat at the kitchen table on the evening of their anniversary, after Me was asleep, and the winter fire was burning low and Levi had gone to check the stock in the cold, and she thought about all of it with the full, clear attention she sometimes brought to the things that mattered most. She had carried her grief here. She had not set it down because you did not set grief down, not the real kind. You carried it, and it changed shape over time, and sometimes it was very heavy, and sometimes it was just the particular weight of love without its person, which was what grief really was, love that had nowhere left to go except inward, circling the absence. But she had discovered, in this limestone house with this careful man, and this extraordinary small person who was Clara's legacy, that grief and love could coexist without one consuming the other. That you could miss Clara fiercely and love Me fully and love Levi in a way that was its own separate thing, its own specific gravity, and all of those things could be true in the same moment in the same body, without any of them making the others false. She had arrived carrying her sister's child and her own grief. He had made room for all of it. The thought settled in her like something true and permanent, like the limestone of the hills, and she was still sitting with it when Levi came back in from the cold, stamping the frost from his boots, his cheeks red and his breath visible in the doorway before he closed it behind him. He looked at her. He always looked at her, she had noticed, the moment he came in, the way you check on the thing that matters most. "All right," he said. "More than all right," she said. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the one she had left on the stove for him, and sat across from her, and she looked at his face in the firelight and felt the full, complicated, wonderful weight of how much she loved him. "Happy anniversary," she said. He smiled. The smile had come more easily since September, since she had started cataloging its appearances. It was a good smile. It changed his whole face from limestone to something warmer. "Happy anniversary," he said. The baby was born in June of 1885, on a Sunday morning when the roses that Celia had transplanted from the Abilene Road were blooming along the porch rail, and the air smelled of heat and sweetness. He was a boy, dark-haired like Me, with Levi's jaw already evident in the determined set of his small face, and he announced his arrival with a voice that suggested he had strong opinions about being removed from his comfortable situation. They named him James, for no particular reason except that it suited him. James Levi Shepard, who was 2 weeks old before he stopped looking faintly outraged about being in the world and began to accept that his immediate conditions were acceptable. Me, who was 2 years and 4 months old and had been briefed on the situation with varying levels of comprehension, accepted her brother with the practical generosity of a toddler who has been guaranteed that the newcomer will not impinge on her relationship with the horses. She looked at him in the manner of someone conducting a review and pronounced, in her developing language, that he was small. "He'll get bigger," Levi told her seriously. Me considered this, and then attempted to share her carved wooden horse with James, placing it carefully beside his head, which was the gesture of a person who understands the important things. Levi watched this, and his face did the thing it did, the warm, open thing that she loved, and Celia, resting in the bed with the pillows piled behind her, and the June light coming through the window, and the boy on her chest and her daughter on the quilt by the bed and her husband in the chair beside her, thought that this was the fullest moment of her life. Not the happiest, because happiness was a thin word for this, a word too small to contain all the things she was feeling, but the fullest. The most populated, with love and people and the particular weight of a life that had been built deliberately, with open hands, from the materials of grief and chance and the willingness to get in a wagon with a stranger. She thought of Clara. She always did in the full moments, in the moments that Clara should have shared. She thought of her sister with gratitude and grief braided so tightly she could not separate them, and she thought, Clara, look what became of us. Look at this. Look at what you left behind. Me on the quilt was talking to the wooden horse. James was asleep. Levi's hand was on her hair. She let herself be there fully in all of it. The years moved through the shepherd's rest with the particular richness of years that are full of actual life. The ranch grew. Levi and Felipe expanded the herd, added a second corral, put a new roof on the barn that Felipe had been saying needed doing for years. Celia's kitchen garden became notable enough that she began selling surplus at the market in Redemption on Saturdays, which was not a financial necessity but a pleasure, and which had the secondary effect of establishing her as a presence in the town that had once whispered about her. Redemption, like most small towns, had a long memory and a slow process for accepting newcomers, but Celia was patient and consistent and honest, and these qualities eventually proved more powerful than its suspicions. She became known for the garden, and for the mending she took in during slow seasons, and for the time she organized the town women to replant the cemetery after a bad spring flood had washed out the fence and the plantings, which she did partly for the community and partly because she wanted Clara's kind of women to be remembered properly, the women who had come before and built things and left behind the important things. She also wrote letters. She had started writing letters to the cemetery in Abilene, to the minister there, about maintaining Clara's grave. She paid for a proper headstone, which she had been unable to afford in the days immediately following the death but could afford now, and the headstone said Clara Lynn Webb, née Harper, 1858–1883, and then the line that Celia had chosen. She made people laugh before the punchline, which was true and which was the truest memorial she could give. Me grew up knowing about her mother. Celia had decided, deliberately and without wavering, that me would not grow up ignorant of Clara, would not discover her origins as a hidden thing, a secret, a betrayal of the woman who had given her life. So from the earliest age that me could understand stories, Celia told them. Clara stories. Clara who was stubborn about the wrong things and right about the important ones. Clara who wrote letters on pale blue paper and made strangers laugh. Clara who had loved me before me, was born with a love that was the reason me was here. Me listened to these stories with great seriousness, the way she listened to the things that mattered, and she grew up with a mother who was present and a mother who was a story, and she seemed to understand, with the particular wisdom of children who are loved well, that both of those things were true and neither of them erased the other. Levi told her about Margaret, too, when she was old enough. He told her simply and honestly, the way he did everything. He told her that before Celia, he had been married to a woman named Margaret who had died with a baby named Daniel, and that this was a sad and real thing that he still thought about sometimes, and that thinking about them did not make him love me or James any less. Me listened to this with the same seriousness and said, "Do you think Daniel would have liked horses?" And Levi had to take a moment before he could answer that he thought so. Yes, he thought Daniel would have liked horses a great deal. The 5th anniversary of their wedding, December 1888, was a celebration that felt significant to both of them in the way that the 5th years do. James was 3.5 and had decided he was going to be a rancher, which everyone accepted with the understanding that he was also 3, and had recently also announced intentions to be a horse, so the commitment was not necessarily final. Me was 5 and had, with the seriousness of a 5-year-old who has made a genuine decision, learned to read from the primer that Mrs. Alcott brought over from the school teacher, and she read to James with the bossy authority of a sister who is fairly sure she is the most competent person in the room, which in her case was often accurate. Celia was expecting again. She told Levi on the porch one December evening, which felt appropriate given the significance the porch held in their particular history, and he received the news with the warm, direct happiness of a man who had stopped being afraid of good things. The third child was a girl. They named her Clara. This was Celia's decision and Levi's immediate agreement, and when they told me that the baby's name would be her mother's name, me was quiet for a long moment and then said, with the precision of a 5-year-old who understood more than she was supposed to, "So she'll always be here." "Yes," Celia said, and held her daughter close. "She'll always be here." Clara Shepard was born in August of 1889, in the same room where James had been born, in the June heat of 4 years prior, with the same roses on the porch rail and the same limestone walls and the same good man in the chair by the bed. And she came into the world quietly, which was a surprise given her siblings, and looked around with dark eyes that were Clara's eyes, the same ones me had. And Celia held her and felt the grief and the love and the gratitude all at once. Inseparable and complete. She was a gift that Clara had not known she was giving. That was the thing about the people who leave you too soon. They leave things behind that they could not have planned to leave, ripples that move out from the center of their living, love that did not stop when they did. Celia thought about this on the afternoon of Clara's birth, with the baby sleeping on her chest and the sounds of the house around her, James conducting some kind of running argument with a fence post in the yard, me sitting on the porch reading, Felipe's voice from the corral, and Levi's hand, as always, finding hers. "Are you happy?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Yes," she said, "I am entirely." He brought her hand to his lips, a small thing tender and exact. "Good," he said. "So am I." The Shepherd's Rest in 1890 was a different place than the rough, quiet, lonely ranch of 1883. Not different in its landscape. The limestone house was the same, the hills the same, the creek the same. Not different in its essential nature, which was still a working cattle ranch in the Texas Hill Country, still run by careful hands with honest books. But different in its interior quality, which was the quality of a place that had been made into a home by the accumulated weight of people who lived in it fully and loved it well. Me was 7, reading everything she could get hold of, with Clara's stubbornness in her face and the kind of mind that was already apparent would take her somewhere significant. Levi said she might be a teacher or a lawyer, and Celia said he should not underestimate what she might find to do with herself, and me said she was going to write books, which everyone received with the appropriate seriousness. James was 5 and had settled on rancher over horse, which was a relief to everyone. He followed Levi and Felipe around the barn, with the intense focus of a boy who is absorbing everything, and the particular shepherd jaw that Celia found more endearing every year. Clara was 1, walking with the unsteady determination of a new walker, investigating everything she could reach, and several things she couldn't, with me's dark eyes and what appeared to be entirely her own personality, which was sunny and firm in equal measure. Celia stood at the kitchen window one October evening and looked out at the yard, where Levi was teaching James the basics of a rope, with the deliberate patience that was so entirely himself, and me was at the porch reading something, and little Clara was sitting in the grass, apparently in intense conversation with a beetle. She thought about September 1883, 7 years ago. The wagon, the stranger, the screaming baby, the carpetbag with its hidden lining of money and its visible lining of desperation. She thought about the grief she had carried in and still carried, because that was the truth of it. Grief did not end. It became part of you, woven into the ordinary fabric of your days so that you could not separate where it ended and you began. But she had done the thing she had come here to do, which was to keep going. And in keeping going she had found that the world had more capacity for her than she had understood, that a stranger could become a husband, that a house could become a home, that a town could become a community, that the thing you carried could also be the thing that connected you to the best of yourself. She had arrived with a child who was not hers and a grief that was. He had opened the door. She thought about the moment on the main street of Redemption in September 1883, this tired, grieving, determined woman with a screaming baby and a name on a piece of paper, and the man in the wagon who had looked at her and said simply, "Get in the wagon." All of it had come from that. All of this, the children, the house, the years, the love, the whole substantial weight of a life built together, all of it had come from a man choosing to be decent in a moment when he could have driven on. She had never told him that. She had not found the words for it, and she was not generally a woman who left important things unsaid, so she made a note to herself to find them. She had them by the time he came in from the yard, James at his heels, little Clara in his arms, the particular end-of-day look on his face that she loved most, the looseness of a man who is in the right place. "Levi," she said. He set Clara down and she made immediately for the furniture. "You pulled up in that wagon 7 years ago," she said, "and you said get in." He looked at her, attentive as always. "I have been grateful every day since," she said. "I wanted you to know that exactly." He was quiet for a moment in the way that he was quiet when something was landing somewhere real. "You could have said no," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "But I was desperate and you had a kind face." He did smile then, the full one, the warm one that changed him entirely. "Clara said that too," he said. "Apparently it's a family opinion." She laughed. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her in the unhurried way of a man who is home and knows it, and James made the sound that 7-year-olds make when their parents behave like this. And from the direction of the porch, me called something about dinner, and little Clara pulled herself up on the kitchen table and clapped. It was, Celia thought, the shape of happiness, not the thin word kind. The real kind, heavy and full and complicated with everything it contained, the grief and the love and the years and the children and the long October, light through the kitchen window over the limestone hills. She had carried her sister's child into a stranger's life, and the stranger had made room for all of it, and the room had become the whole world. She would tell Clara's story, her sister's story, for the rest of her life, to me and James and little Clara and whoever else came, and the telling would keep her alive in the way that stories keep people alive, in the continued breathing warmth of love that does not stop when the person does. That was the gift of it. That was the thing she understood now that she had not understood on the street in Redemption in September 1883, desperate and exhausted, and carrying everything she had left in the world. You did not have to be whole to begin again. You just had to get in the wagon. The years that followed were quiet in the way that full years are, not empty but steady. The rhythm of work and season, and the children growing, and the ranch prospering, and the life between two people who have chosen each other becoming, over time, the most natural thing in the world. Natural like the creek and the hills, and the wide Texas sky that they looked out at every morning from the porch that had become their particular sanctuary. They were there one evening in the spring of 1892, the two of them, the children inside with the sounds of their living, the coyotes beginning at the edge of the pasture, the stars coming out slow and brilliant over the dark hills, and Celia leaned her head on Levi's shoulder and he put his arm around her and they sat in the comfortable silence that was their oldest language. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Clara," she said, "and how I ended up here. And how strange and good it all is." "Strange and good," he repeated. "Strange that a telegram about my sister's death led me to you," she said. "Good that it did." He was quiet, holding her close. "I think about Margaret and Daniel," he said. "I think about how if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been here. I wouldn't have been the man you walked up to on the street." He paused. "I think the things we lose make a path to the things we find. I don't know if that's comfort or just pattern making, but it's what I have." She lifted her head and looked at him in the dark, this man who was her home, and she thought that it was both, comfort and pattern, truth and story. the way that all the truest things were both at once. "It's enough," she said. He kissed the top of her head. Me called from inside about something. James shouted a response. Little Clara, who had opinions about everything, added her own. The stars came fully out above the Shepherd's Rest, above the limestone hills and the cedar and the creek and the house that had been made into a home, and the two people on the porch sat in the warmth of everything they had built together, which was substantial and solid and would last, and were not afraid of anything any more. That was, in the end, the whole of it. She had come with a child who had no one else and a grief that had no bottom. He had looked at her and said, "Get in the wagon." He had made room, deliberately, carefully, with his whole life, for all of it, the baby and the grief and the woman who was carrying both of them. And she had stayed. And it had been, in every way that truly mattered, everything.